Hello everyone, I'm Dan, and this is what we're going to be making today. So this is an overview of the entire node layout. You can see that we have a group here for determining how much wear is being applied to the model in different places. Some rust presence, so basically whether there's rust on a certain part of the metal or not. Then metal rust blend, this creates a material that blends between clean metal and rust. Underneath here we have paint, which is responsible for creating the paint material that we see over the top of it all. And grime, which is just for adding a sort of layer of fine dust and dirt over the top of everything in all the crevices and stuff. I'm going to be going through how I've put together all of this stuff and more in this video. The important thing to note here is that this uses no pre-made textures. There's nothing that's been bought from any asset sites. This is 100% from scratch, so you will not need to go and download anything to follow this tutorial. The first thing that you'll want to do is build a base mesh. This is just a really simple barrel mesh that I threw together in about 5 minutes tops. This should be easily achievable by just using the circle tool and extruding out the circle into a cylinder with these ridges on it. Also, I've added a cap on the top here that's been offset to the side, which just acts as the cap over where stuff goes in and out of the barrel. The most important part of this shading stack is definitely all of the different masks and maps that I've generated from the model. I'm going to start with this edgeware map, which you can see I've put into a node group so that I can reuse it wherever I want. If we take a look inside, you'll see the setup is relatively simple. It starts off with an ambient occlusion node, and this ambient occlusion node has been set to inside and only local with a relatively small distance. What this basically means is it will look for all of the corners and extrema in the model which are furthest away from those big central interior areas. These areas are most likely to be on the edge of the object, and the edges of objects often get bumped up against things, so they tend to rust and decay away much more quickly than more sheltered areas, which in this mask are whiter. However, of course, things don't wear perfectly evenly, so we want to add a little bit of noise. So I firstly create a noise texture here, and you can see it's a pretty fine noise, it's got lots of detail, sort of looks quite gritty. And the first thing I do is I reduce the value of it by taking away 0.7. So you can see this makes it much darker. What this means is that we can then add it to the ambient occlusion, and you can see that we get this sort of noisier version of the original ambient occlusion node. Then, just so I can increase the contrast, I use a map range node here. You could also use a color ramp, but I prefer map range. And this gives us a slightly higher contrast result. I think this should especially be visible up on the top here, so compare the add and the map range. Next up, I'm going to show you the scratch map. Now, it might be a bit hard to see on video, but if we zoom all the way in, you can see that we have these various gashes and scratches and gouges across the surface. Let's take a look inside this node group, and you'll see we have yet more node groups. What I've actually done here is I've created a few scratch layers. Each scratch layer represents scratches in a certain direction. You can see as I switch between them, the scratches change directions. So let's take a look at how a single scratch layer has been put together. So first things first is that we rotate the coordinates that we get in using this rotation also from the outside. And what that does, that just rotates all of these scratches to be a certain direction that we can choose. The next thing we do is we scale up the coordinates along the x-axis to make them really long when we plug them into the noise texture here. So if we actually take a look at the noise texture, you can see it's very stretched in one direction. That's what this x does. So if we were to reduce this all the way down to something smaller like 1.3, you can see it's no longer stretched. If we increase this back up to, I think it was like 54 or something, you can see we now have these long scratches across the surface. And the next thing we do is we use a map range to essentially just take the most high values and leave everything else to be black. You can think of this again like a color ramp, but I just prefer to use map range. You can see we're just taking from 0.8 to 1 and we're expanding it to be from 0 to 1. Everything else will just be sort of cut away. So you can see here one level above, we have our scratch layers here. They have different levels of rotation, so 153 degrees, 317 degrees, 108 degrees, and 45.8 degrees. And we are adding them all together. We're clamping the final result to make sure that it's between 0 and 1, so it's not going below black or above white. And the result is our scratch map. So you can see lots and lots and lots of scratches all across our barrel. Lovely jubbly. Now it's time to take a look at the grime map. So as you can see here, this is sort of a dirty looking thing, and indeed it is used to add dirt to the texture at the very end. So if we take a look at the nodes, you can see again they're relatively simple. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to take our position and we want to scale it up by 3 on the horizontal axes and 0.4 on the vertical axes. What this does is this sort of stretches out the noise texture that comes after it to be vertical, similar to what we did before for the scratches, but a bit less intense. You can see if we were to just bypass it, we'd get much more uniform dirt, which doesn't look super realistic. Dirt likes to fall down because gravity. So there we go. Now, of course, the noise texture on its own does not look particularly convincing. As you can see here, it's very, very boring. So what we really want to do is we want to emphasize the dirt in all of the crevices. Well, what we can do is we can use our old friend, the ambient occlusion node. This is normally used to add shadows to things, but as we saw before with the edgeware map, we can use it for our own purposes. So I've set the distance to 1, I set it to be only local, so it's not receiving any occlusion from the ground, just because you might want to use this as a game asset or something where you don't know what your environment looks like, so you may as well not make assumptions. I'm using 2 add nodes here in order to add the noise in, which looks a bit like this. First thing I do is I make the noise darker, and then I add that with the ambient occlusion, which you can see gives us this sort of grayscale texture, which looks a little bit grimy-ish. You can see these really dark textures where the grimes are going to be, and it looks much lighter where it's not going to be. So again, I use a map range node in order to sort of make the bright areas whiter and the dark areas darker. So those are the basic maps that I used in order to build this material. There are some more node groups that I'm going to go into as we discover them, but just keep in mind that edgeware, the scratches, and the grime are the main 3 things that contribute to the texture of this thing. So let's now look at what this wear group is doing. As you can see here, we have our scratches, our edgeware, and we're combining them together to create this gouge amount. If we take a look at the texture, you can see that it's very dark where everything is supposed to be, less gouged out, and it looks very bright where things should be worn away. It's a pretty simple combination. You can see I'm just making the scratches more intense by multiplying them, and I'm taking the scratches away from the edgeware to sort of eat into the material a bit more. And you can see I just invert the result to get our gouge amount because these maps were bright in the clean areas and I wanted to have the clean areas be dark in the final result. Let's now talk about rust presence. So you can see here that I've created this sort of noisy texture to determine where the rust should be versus where there should be clean metal. In this texture, white is where rust is and the black is where the metal should be clean. So you can see this is a very, very rusty barrel. As always, you start off with a noise texture, and you can see here I chose again a suitably rough one. I'm taking this gouge amount from earlier and I'm connecting it up into this multiply node, which basically makes it a bit weaker, and it takes it away from the noise texture, which gives us this result here. You can see it is slightly darker around these more worn out areas. It's a very subtle effect. So if I compare it to the regular noise texture, you can see it is very, very subtle. And then I use a map range to increase the contrast of this texture, like so. So you can see now this is super high contrast, and you can see we have that very subtle, more presence of bare metal around the edges. The reason why is because those edges often get, knocked and scraped as the thing gets moved around. So the rust will get scraped off, whereas those more, pristine areas, they're going to have the opportunity to have rust build up without being scraped away by usage. So using that rust presence map, you can now start working on your rust and metal material. So that's controlled by this node group here. You can see we have metal and rust, and we're mixing it all together, and we're putting it into one principled BSDF shader. Starting off with this metal texture here, if we take a look at the node setup, it's pretty simple. We just have a rather grey base color, a metalness of 1, and a roughness which is driven by a noise texture. This is pretty standard stuff. What this gives you is a pretty smooth metal looking thing. But if we wait for the cycles renderer to clear up a bit, you can see the roughness ever so slightly varies. It just makes it look a little bit more believable, ever so slightly. The rust shaders, of course, are a little bit more complicated. You can see, though, that it is just like a solid layer of rust. If we take a look at the node setup, you can see that I have this Musgrave texture. I'm not quite sure how you pronounce it, but you can think of this as basically a noise texture with more knobs and dials. I'm just using this to generate some noise, which then drives a color ramp, which drives the amount of brownness in the rust. So you can see that some of the areas are lighter, some of them are darker. That's driven by the Musgrave texture. And then we also multiply it by a small number, and we use that for the height. We'll get into that in a second. But you can also see that here we set the metalness to 0 and the roughness to 0.9 because it is indeed very rough. So those node groups output here their base color, metalness, roughness, and their height. And you can see here with our rust present, we have our map range that we just looked at, which tells us where the metal and the rust is going to be. So what I do is I have this column of mixes and a multiply, which just takes in that map range and it blends between the metalness, the roughness, the base color, and the height between the metal and the rust. Now, of course, the metal does not output a height, so for the height, we just multiply it. So if there's lots of rust, then the height is just allowed to be, fully there. If the rust is not there at all, then the height does not vary whatsoever. We stick that in a bump node, we stick everything inside a principled BSDF node, and the result is this, which is a lovely rusty barrel. And if you actually look a little bit closely, you might just be able to see some scratches and some edge wear from that old gouge amount node that we had earlier. Now let's talk about paint, because this isn't a painted barrel without a layer of flaky paint. If we take a closer look here, you can see that the paint is indeed quite flaky. And you can see it's very, very detailed. We've got lots of height information here. And I'm just going to show you how I put this together. So I'm going to be introducing the concept of ambient occlusion here. So the AO output here basically controls how much light is receiving a certain part of the material. And the way that I model that, because the principled BSDF does not natively do this, is I use a mix shader after my principled BSDF, which mixes with nothing, so the color black, and the AO here just controls it. So if the AO is, fully black, then the material will be fully black with no light reflecting off into the camera. Whereas if the AO is 1, then that means the material is receiving all of the light from the scene. So the principled BSDF will be allowed to shine through and get all of that light into the camera. Other than that though, you can see that all of the outputs of this node group are going straight into the principled BSDF, and the height of course is going into a bump node, so we can get that beautiful bumpy geometry. Inside this node group, you can see that it's a little bit complicated. We have this flake removal thing up at the top, which we will get back to. But under here, you can see we have a flake map and a paint map. Let's take a look at the paint map first. So I started off by making a relatively clean paint job. You can see there is some very subtle height variation here. If we take a look at the node group, you can see we have a yellow base color, no metalness, a pretty low roughness, and we have this noise texture here, which is multiplied by 0.1 in order to get a height value, which is what gives us these tiny little bumps on the surface of our paint job. So this looks like, a freshly painted barrel. Something important to note here, by the way, about the height is that it does eventually get multiplied by 0.001. I have removed some of the other nodes just so you can see this relationship a little bit more clearly, but just to let you know that the height is like 1,000 times less powerful than it is output from that node. So next up, we're going to be taking a look at the flakes node group, and this is responsible for creating that height variation and also responsible for our ambient occlusion, which you can see here is responsible for making those dark lines in between the paint flakes. The node setup here is a little bit more complicated, so let me walk you through it. This node group is based basically around the Voronoi texture here, which you can see looks like this. But the first thing I want to mention is that this is what a Voronoi texture normally looks like when you set it to distance to edge. It looks a bit too clean though, so what I like to do is down here with our geometry here, you can see we're taking a position, and we're going to take a noise texture, we're going to scale it down a little bit, and we're going to add it to our position. And what you can see is that it roughens everything up, makes everything less perfect. And so that's what this group of nodes here is doing. So as you saw, this wobbly position here gets plugged into this Voronoi texture with distance to edge. And we're currently looking at that right now. You can see this basically tells us where those edges are. We pass it through a map range node, which if we take a look, we're just basically getting just those edges. And we will then output that directly to our AO node. So this is what's used in order to block the light from going in those crevices. The rest of these nodes are to do with the height, so we'll just pull them over here so we can focus on them. So the first thing we do is we invert the output of that Voronoi distance to edge texture thing, and we multiply it with a noise texture. So if we get a material output and we plug it in there, you can see that we essentially get this kind of bumpy, uneven surface. So just to remind ourselves, this is what the inverted Voronoi texture looks like. You can see where all the edges are. This is what the noise texture looks like. You can see it's quite bumpy and uneven. When we multiply those, you can see we get somewhere between the two where the edges are sort of there, but we also have lots of bumpy surface stuff. We can use a gamma node to really emphasize the effect. So you can see that lots of these areas are now black and sort of low down, but we have these periodic spikes up, and you can see that the edges are still kind of visible in there. It looks quite interesting and dynamic. Of course, there's a problem here though. All of the paint flakes are still at the same height. We're basically just bringing up those edges in random places. So what I want to do is I get another Voronoi texture with the same settings as before, except set to F1 with Euclidean distance. And what that will do, if you take the color node, is it gives you a different color for every single paint flake. We can use this in order to randomize the height of every single paint flake. What we do is we turn that color into a value and multiply it by 0.1, which you can see just gives us this sort of height map here. And we add it to the stuff we generated before, which you can see we have that same sort of raised edge, interesting dynamic stuff. But now you can actually see other edges here from where the paint flakes are at different heights. And finally, we can multiply it with our AO stuff, which just makes those crevices right back down, pulls them right back down so that they look like little dips in the height. Now, coming back up to here where the flakes in the paint existed, you can see that the AO gets passed straight out to our shaders, and the height gets combined with the height of the paint here and multiplied by that 0.001 and then passed out. Don't worry about alpha, we will come back to that. And of course, just to remind you where all of this is located in this flaky paint node group, and you can see that it all just gets plugged into principled BSDF with a bump node here, and we turn the AO into this factor for this mix shader, and you can see the entire thing together looks like a lot of flaky paint. You can see that the sunlight sort of gets scattered and bumped around as it reflects off of the paint flakes. You can see some of these edges are lifted up a bit. It's quite visually interesting. We have all these cracks. And because of the AO, you can see even if we're looking at a dark side where there's not much sunlight to reflect off of, those cracks still appear quite dark. So now we need to combine our paint and our rust and our metal. So that's what this alpha thing is doing. If we take a look at the output of this mix shader here, which uses the alpha from the paint, you can see that it sort of chips away some of the paint and reveals the metal and the rust underneath. So in order to do this, I take the gouge amount from before, remember that's the edge wear and the scratches, and I am plugging it into this flaky paint node, which is what's generating that alpha mask. If we take a look in here and go up to flake removal here, you can see we have our gouge amount, which I've mislabeled here, and you can see I have this noise texture here. As you can see, the noise texture is rather smooth and sort of big, and that's because we want to have those big splotches of missing paint. What I do is I do a multiply add thing, so this is a math node. If I get the output here, you can see that it's basically just got a few bright splodges in a few places, and the rest of it is completely dark. You can probably tell this is where the paint is going to be removed. I'm then adding in that gouging, that edge wear, those scratches. I'm adding it all in, and you can see that those are here as well. So basically, wherever the edge has been worn down or where there's been a scratch, the paint's going to be removed there. And I then use a less than operator down here, again the math node, and this basically turns it from grayscale to being sort of binary. It's either there or it's not, because you don't usually get paint that's like 50% opacity. It's usually either there's paint there or it's fallen off and it's on the ground somewhere, decaying into biological matter. And that gives us the final alpha map. So you can see here that it's white where the paint's going to be chipped away, and it's black where the paint should be. If we go back to our main material and get rid of this material output quickly, and we take a look at this mix shader, you will see that this alpha map will have the paint in most of those black places, and you can see the paint looks just as good as ever, but you can see that there's just these certain splodges here which just show through all of that rust and that metal, which is exactly what we want. We're almost done now, hold it together. We're just going to take a look at the grime layer, because it's perfectly true that we had a pretty good looking barrel, but everything could use a little more dust. So the job of this grime layer is just to make everything look a little bit more dusty, a little bit more dirty, just make it look a little bit less well kept. You can see it looks a bit like this. So if we take a look at the node layout, you can see we have this grime here, which if we plug in the output of this node group, you can see that this is determining where all of that dirt will be. The first thing we do is we plug it into a color ramp, which just determines the darkness of the dirt. You can see here that where there's more dirt, the dirt is brighter because it's been piled up more, it's sort of above all of the other dirt, so it's catching more light. And the places where there's less dirt, the dirt is darker because, you know, it's kind of on its own, it's feeling a bit lonely and it's a bit under the weather. We plug that right into the base color of a principled BSDF shader, which is not metallic, which is fully rough because we don't want this to be like shiny dirt, so it'd be a bit weird. And you can see we are also putting the grime in a bump map with the normal here. And the output of that looks a little bit like this. So you can see if we look up on the top here, you will be able to detect an ever so subtle amount of bump. You can see there's just a teeny tiny little amount of shading, just enough to sell the fact that there's dirt here. It's generally quite a simple shader, if we take a look here. So what we want to do now is we want to sort of cut away all of this dark area and show the original shader underneath. So what we do is we get a mix shader, which we just plug in our grime here. We use a map range just to increase the contrast a tiny bit. If we plug in our old material from before and we view the output of this, you'll see the final shader. So if we take a close look, you'll be able to see that there are these sort of lines of dust and dirt across the top of the rings. And just under the lip here, you can see there's all of these vertical stripes of dirt. And you can see on the top, there's also a fine smattering as well. And that yields you your final result. That is the entire shader. This has been a video from me, Dan, and I will see you guys next time. Have fun!